Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today is a filler topic while I work on my Poland videos. However, this one took a lot more research and I'm really excited to talk to you about this today. So if you find this interesting, or want to see more of this in the future, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing because it really helps me out. Thank you all, and please enjoy. Today we are going to be talking about the chariot. It was an integral piece of Bronze Age warfare, and its use during this time period is not seen in any other time in history. The concept is quite simple, a carriage that allows the rider ease of ability to attack. However, the ways it was used vary wildly, so let's jump right in. While the horse was tamed on the Eurasian steppe by the Indo-Europeans, the second component of the chariot, the wheel, was most likely discovered in the Mesopotamian river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates in modern-day Iraq. This is where most historians agree the Bronze Age chariot was first created. These early chariots were large, slow, tank-like creations. Rather than being pulled by horses, these were pulled by the much more common donkeys, and were mostly used in warfare for carrying melee units. Later Sumerians would create a more recognizable two-wheeled chariot, pulled by horses. However, these were used almost like taxis in the early Bronze Age warfare. They would ferry troops around the battlefield to necessary parts that needed reinforcing, mainly staying behind the lines to stay protected. There isn't really anything like this in the modern day. It's hard to imagine a truck coming up from behind a line of soldiers in the heat of battle to move them elsewhere, except in an evacuation. This wasn't really useful in any meaningful way, especially since the cost of making and maintaining a chariot, which we will discuss later. By the mid-Bronze Age, around 1500 to 1000 BCE, the chariot became an integral part of warfare. While many civilizations used the chariot, such as Israel, Assyria, Babylon, the two masters of the vehicle were undoubtedly the Hittites and the Egyptians. First, let's talk about the Hittites. Briefly, they were an ancient nation occupying the same land as modern-day Turkey, in Anatolia, with a unique culture and a lot of mineral deposits which were used to make bronze. As you may guess, bronze was very important to the Bronze Age. It's in the name, and through trade, this made the Hittites a wealthy and powerful nation. Since they bordered Egypt, another great power, you can imagine the necessity to protect their border. This, plus the mineral deposits, allowed for a robust military. They designed a lighter chariot designed with an interesting 4-spoke wheel as opposed to the 8 spokes placed in the middle of the chariot as opposed to the back. Also, in these chariot designs, there were 3 charioteers instead of the normal 2 at a time. They had an archer and a driver, as well as someone who held a shield and could fight as infantry when dismounted, which was something useful if the chariot ever broke down, which was very common, as they could defend it themselves, something which other powers' chariots lacked the ability to do. The Hittites were also renowned horse tamers, reportedly having some of the best trained and fastest horses in the ancient world. The process in selecting the right horse for a chariot was even more rigorous than selecting a rider. Accounts from around this time report a half-week-long selection process, as well as more than half-a-year training program. It involves easy exercises without any weight, but moves into more extreme training. The focus is only on the horse, and it was important not to hurt the animal in battle, because you could capture enemy horses and they could be used afterwards for your own chariots. Moving on, we have indisputably the largest power in the ancient world, Egypt. Their chariots are recognizable by almost anyone as they are depicted in their art, and they too have a unique design. The Egyptian chariots had a much smaller platform and later would only require one driver who also had a composite bow. The quiver was mounted on the side of the chariot for ease of access to arrows. While all chariot upkeep was high, the craftsmanship required to make these raised the cost of an Egyptian chariot extremely high. This meant that they could not afford to lose it in battle. Due to the high cost of Egyptian chariots and the amount of training needed to use one with less people, they were only accessible to rich soldiers. It required years of training to drive one, and losing a charioteer was almost as bad as losing the chariot itself. As such, the Egyptian army ended up being built around protecting them at all costs by the end of the Bronze Age. Remember that, because that will come up later. Speaking of army tactics, the chariot was the centerpiece of the army, akin to knights in the medieval era and tanks in the modern day, especially World War II. In the broader, ancient world, there were many ways to outfit a chariot, but it was mainly split between 2 categories, light/medium, and heavy. While light and medium chariots were smaller and faster, this does not mean they were cheap to produce. You still had to armor its crewmen and the horses. You could have a driver and a shield bearer with an archer and shotgun, almost like early planes in World War I in the interwar period, which was a common way to outfit these chariots in the ancient world. You could also use melee weapons, which could be used to break a line of infantry. These lighter chariots were used more for hit-and-run tactics and could also be carried across rough terrain if dismantled. Heavy chariots were almost a completely different weapon. They were shock troops, used to lead attacks. They were much less common, however, and fell out of favor due to specific weaknesses in the chariot that made them less successful as assault troops. These employed crews of 4 men at most, especially used in Persia where a team of 4 horses might pull a chariot with large wheels. Long spears were especially useful in this scenario because it could be easily wielded by one of the crewmen, since it was easier to keep stable. Due to its larger size, however, it could only be used in select scenarios with mixed results. Simply dismounting a driver was enough to put a chariot out of commission, and the high loss caused them to stop being produced. And that was basically the end of heavy chariots in use in war. Over time, however, the light chariot would slowly take precedent over any other troop, and the army designed around it. But we will talk about that in a second. First, we have to talk about the largest chariot battle in history, the Battle of Kadesh. One of the more famous battles in the Bronze Age, it was at peak chariot use. For comparison, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, had 6,000 tanks. That's about how many chariots were in Kadesh that day. Led by Ramses II, the Egyptians attacked the city. There was no strategic reason to take the city, it was just symbolic of who was the greater power between Egypt and the Hittites. During this battle, the Hittites had initial success against the Egyptians, fighting against their infantry. In this battle they were using some heavier chariots, however, which allowed for the Egyptian chariots to flank them, pushing them back to camp across the river line and out of Kadesh. This retreat is shown in an amazing piece of Egyptian art, which is as well one of our main sources for this battle. The important thing here is to remember how chariots are what mattered. No well-formed line of infantry could outrun it or take it down. You also have to draw a comparison to tanks and knights. Knights were noblemen who required training, not just some peasant levy. If you lost a knight, you lost a man who was of noble birth. Also remember how I compared chariots to early tanks. This isn't because of their lack of power. It's the opposite problem, actually. World War tanks could not be mass-produced, and neither could chariots. Each one required craftsmanship and were not standardized. There was no manufacturer, and each soldier had to purchase his own horses, weapons, etc. This would be the downfall of the chariot. Compared to a chariot, a single infantryman was worthless. The Bronze Age collapse attacked every vulnerability in the chariot. Warfare-wise, the new enemy was the Sea People, which I won't cover in much detail, but all you need to know is that there were a lot of them. Since surrounded light chariots couldn't defend themselves, they required tons of infantry to protect them. These Sea Peoples were not heavy infantry like the chariots were used to fighting. They were hordes of light and fast soldiers that could rout and outflank these protective lines, which made up their armies. While chariots were fast, having 2 horses and 2 wheels made them hard to turn. Even though they can outrun most infantry, these skirmishers outnumbered and surrounded them. This must have cost these countries dearly as losing these chariots became more and more frequent. Speaking of cost, the Bronze Age collapse brought economic disaster as well. Famine caused more farmers to be necessary, making artisans in high demand. Finding someone with the skills to make a chariot became harder and more costly. This, combined with the fact that these nations were losing chariots at a faster rate, meant they could not afford to build any more chariots without cutting costs on other stuff, causing revolt. With Bronze Age collapse, the skills used to make and drive chariots were lost in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, they survived in other pockets in other parts of the world. So what were these other places? While Persia continued to use an interesting variation of a heavy chariot, they were not useful on rough terrain, which is just what they were facing when they invaded Greece. Greece stuck to infantry, which was useful in the mountains as opposed to horses, and especially chariots. With Rome taking a lot of cues from Greece, they refined the Greek hoplite soldier into their famous legions and did not use any chariots. Like I said, however, chariots survived elsewhere, especially with the Gauls and Celts. They had a very light chariot with a heavily armored warrior used in close combat. These were often noblemen and were used to evacuate them if need be. Rome rediscovered the chariot from the Gauls and used it for war once more near the end of their empire. They surprisingly returned to the taxi idea, which didn't work, especially since they were facing similar enemies like the Sea Peoples that killed off the chariot in the Bronze Age. I didn't discuss non-European chariots in this video because they follow a diverging design idea, and war elephants mostly filled that niche that they occupied for the Middle East. but perhaps I'll talk about them in another video. If you like and subscribe, that is. Thank you for watching. This was a topic I was really excited to talk about, and I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.